There is a place in the Atlantic Ocean so deep it could swallow Mount Everest, and you'd still have a mile of water above the summit. It sits right next to millions of people. It's technically within reach of modern science, and we barely know what's down there. The Puerto Rico Trench drops over 5 miles beneath the surface. At that depth, the pressure would crush a submarine like a tin can. There is no light, no warmth, no mercy, and something is living there, not just surviving, thriving. In one of the most hostile environments on the planet, creatures have been found that science is still struggling to explain. Things that glow in total darkness, things that look like nothing until they move, things that have no business existing at all by any logic we understand. But the biology is only part of what makes this place strange. The trench doesn't just sit there quietly. It sits on a fault line, a crack where one of Earth's tectonic plates is slowly grinding beneath another. This is the same zone that sent a tsunami crashing into Puerto Rico in 1918, the same zone that has scientists watching closely today. Every time a submarine descends into it, it comes back with something unexpected. Sometimes the footage cuts out. Sometimes what the cameras capture doesn't repeat, like the trench only shows you something once, and then it's gone. We're going down there today, and what's been found at the bottom is going to stay with you. If you want more explorations like this, subscribe and drop a like so this one reaches more people. It takes a second, and it genuinely matters. Now, let's descend. Beneath the surface of the Atlantic, the seafloor does not remain level for long. It bends, stretches, and then, almost without warning, falls away into a narrow corridor that traces a quiet boundary between vast sections of the Earth. This is where the Puerto Rico Trench takes shape, extending along the northern edge of the Caribbean, just beyond the islands that rest in warm, sunlit waters above. From the shorelines of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, nothing suggests how abruptly the ocean floor descends nearby, as if the familiar world simply gives way to something far less stable beneath. This trench exists because two immense pieces of the Earth's outer shell move in slow, unbroken contact. The North American plate, carrying with it the weight of an entire continent, presses gradually against the smaller Caribbean plate. Over time, this pressure forces the denser plate to bend and sink beneath the other, a process that unfolds so slowly it escapes immediate perception. Yet across millions of years, that steady motion has carved a deep, elongated depression into the seafloor, shaping a feature that stretches for hundreds of kilometers. Its form is not wide or open, but narrow and sharply defined, like a long scar pressed into the ocean floor. The slopes that lead into it are uneven, marked by ridges and subtle folds where the crust has been compressed and reshaped. Sediments drift downward along these inclines, settling into quieter pockets, while other areas remain exposed, revealing older layers of the earth that have been drawn downward over time. The trench does not exist as a single uniform channel, but as a shifting landscape where depth and structure vary along its length. Unlike the great trenches of the Pacific, which often form along more active and clearly defined subduction zones, this Atlantic feature reflects a different kind of tectonic interaction. The motion here is less direct, more complex, influenced by the surrounding plates and the constraints of a smaller ocean basin. The Atlantic, still widening over geological time, does not produce trenches with the same frequency or scale as the Pacific. As a result, the Puerto Rico Trench stands out as an unusual structure in this region, shaped by forces that are both persistent and restrained. Even within this slower framework, the area remains active. Stress accumulates along the boundary as the plates continue their gradual movement, storing energy that is occasionally released in sudden shifts. These releases travel outward as seismic waves, subtle at times, more pronounced at others, reminding the surface world that the boundary below is never entirely at rest. The seafloor itself records this activity, with fractures and displaced sections marking where tension has altered the landscape. This ongoing motion also influences the shape of the trench over time. Sections may deepen slightly, while others shift or collapse inward, creating a structure that is never fully fixed. What appears stable on a human timescale is in truth part of a continuous transformation guided by forces that operate far beyond immediate observation. The trench is not simply a static feature, but a process captured in form, a visible trace of the Earth adjusting itself along a fragile edge. In this place, geography and motion remain closely tied, each shaping the other in quiet succession. The islands above rest on one side of this boundary, while beneath them, the seafloor continues its slow descent, carrying fragments of the planet deeper into itself. The trench becomes, in this way, more than a depth. It is a record of pressure, movement, and time, held in a narrow stretch of ocean where the surface gives no sign of what unfolds below. Long before any vessel descends, the attempt begins as a careful negotiation with distance, pressure, and time. Reaching the depths of the Puerto Rico Trench is not simply a matter of traveling downward, but of sustaining presence in a place that resists prolonged observation. Each expedition must carry with it everything required to survive the descent and return intact, and even then, the margin for error remains narrow. As a result, only a limited number of missions have ever approached these depths, far fewer than those sent to more frequently studied regions of the ocean. The effort required to reach the trench is substantial. Specialized submersibles must be constructed to withstand immense pressure, their hulls designed with precise curvature and reinforced materials that can endure forces far beyond surface conditions. These vehicles are costly to build and maintain, and each deployment involves extensive planning, coordination, and support from research vessels above. Weather conditions, equipment reliability, and communication systems all influence whether a mission can proceed, adding further uncertainty to each attempt. Even when a descent is successful, time at the seafloor remains brief. Submersibles rely on limited energy reserves, carefully rationed between descent, observation, and ascent. Every movement, every adjustment of lights or instruments draws from that finite supply. As a result, observations are often constrained to narrow windows, where only a small portion of the trench can be seen before the vehicle must begin its return. What is recorded in those moments becomes a fragment, a glimpse rather than a complete view. Mapping the trench presents its own challenges. Sonar systems can outline the general shape of the seafloor, sending sound waves downward and interpreting their return. Yet these readings are not always precise. Variations in terrain, sediment composition, and depth can distort signals, leaving gaps or inconsistencies in the resulting maps. High-resolution imaging requires closer proximity, but reaching every section of such an extended structure is not easily achieved. Large areas remain represented only by approximations, their finer details still unresolved. Compared to trenches in the Pacific, where decades of repeated exploration have produced more comprehensive data, the Puerto Rico Trench has received less sustained attention. Its location, though relatively close to populated regions, does not lessen the technical demands of studying it. In some ways, its position within the Atlantic, where deep trenches are less common, has meant fewer dedicated missions and less continuous observation. The result is a body of knowledge that grows slowly, shaped by intermittent visits rather than constant study. Unmanned vehicles have extended the reach of exploration, allowing instruments to descend without the constraints of human occupancy. These remotely operated or autonomous systems can remain at depth for longer periods, gathering data and capturing imagery. Yet even these technologies face limitations. Communication delays, restricted maneuverability, and the complexity of navigating uneven terrain all influence what can be achieved during a single deployment. Data returns to the surface in segments, requiring careful interpretation and often leaving uncertainties behind. Across the length of the trench, there are stretches that have never been directly observed. Between the points where submersibles have touched down or instruments have passed through, there exist intervals of seafloor that remain entirely unvisited. These unseen sections are not empty, but simply beyond the reach of current exploration efforts. Their contours, their features, and the forms of life they may contain remain unrecorded, held within the same slow processes that shaped them. In this way, the trench reveals itself in pieces, each expedition adding to a growing but incomplete picture. What has been seen offers insight, yet also emphasizes how much lies beyond those brief encounters. The deeper structure extends outward and downward, continuing beyond the limits of observation, where absence of data does not imply absence of detail, only the persistence of distance between what is present and what has been reached. There is a gradual moment in the descent when brightness does not fade evenly, but withdraws in layers, as if the ocean is quietly folding light back into itself. At first, color softens, losing its sharpness, then tones shift toward blue, and eventually, even that faint illumination begins to dissolve. By the time a depth of around 1,000 meters is reached, sunlight has already been reduced to a dim trace, scattered and weakened beyond recognition. A little deeper, and it disappears entirely, leaving no visible connection to the world above. Beyond this boundary, the ocean becomes a place where light no longer arrives. There is no horizon, no distinction between distance and proximity, only a continuous absence that remains unchanged regardless of direction. Movement through this space does not reveal new forms unless something produces its own illumination. Without an external source, visibility ceases to function in any conventional sense. Surfaces, shapes, and motion exist, yet remain concealed unless briefly revealed by artificial beams or the faint glow of living organisms. For many forms of life, the concept of sight shifts from primary sense to diminishing relevance. Eyes, when present, are often reduced or altered, adapted not for clarity but for sensitivity to the smallest traces of light. In some species, they disappear entirely, replaced by other means of perceiving the surrounding environment. Pressure, vibration, and chemical signals begin to define awareness, allowing organisms to navigate and respond without relying on vision. The ocean at this depth does not reward those that depend on sight alone, and over time, life has adjusted accordingly. The absence of light also alters the perception of space itself. Without visual reference points, distance becomes difficult to interpret, even for instruments designed to measure it. Objects may be near or far, yet without illumination, their position remains uncertain until contact or detection through other means occurs. This creates an environment where movement is cautious and deliberate, guided by signals that do not rely on reflection or color. The darkness is not empty, but it conceals its contents completely, offering no visual cues to those within it. In such conditions, biological processes begin to diverge from those seen closer to the surface. Pigmentation loses its purpose, as color holds no function in a space where it cannot be seen. Structures that once evolved for display or camouflage become unnecessary, gradually reduced or repurposed. Energy is conserved in different ways, directed toward survival mechanisms that do not depend on light. Over long periods, these changes accumulate, shaping organisms that are suited to a world defined by absence rather than presence. The transition into permanent darkness is not a sudden barrier, but a threshold that, once crossed, is never reversed within that environment. Above it, light continues its daily cycle, shifting with time and weather. But below it, there is no variation, no rhythm tied to the Sunday. Life here does not follow patterns of day and night, but exists within a constant state, where time is marked by processes other than light. Growth, movement, and interaction continue, yet they do so without the visual markers that define them elsewhere. In this stillness, the role of light changes from a universal presence to a rare and deliberate signal. When it appears, it is created rather than received, emerging from within living forms rather than descending from above. These brief illuminations do not restore the lost brightness, but instead introduce momentary points of reference, small and shifting, within a vast and uninterrupted dark. Weight gathers here in a way that cannot be seen, only endured. With every meter of descent, the ocean adds another layer, another quiet accumulation pressing downward from all directions at once. By the time the deepest parts of the trench are reached, that weight has become immense, exceeding 1,000 times the pressure felt at the surface. It is not a force that arrives suddenly, but one that builds continuously, surrounding every surface, entering every gap, leaving no space untouched. Materials that remain rigid above begin to reveal their limits in these conditions. Structures that depend on internal emptiness, on air-filled spaces or fixed frameworks, lose their stability as pressure compresses them inward. Metals can bend, seals can fail, and anything designed to resist force from a single direction struggles when that force arrives equally from all sides. The deeper environment does not allow for imbalance, and it does not tolerate resistance in the way the surface world might. Life that persists here does not oppose this pressure in the same way. Instead of resisting, it yields, shaped by the surrounding force rather than standing against it. Many organisms lack the hard skeletons or gas-filled cavities that would collapse under such conditions. Their bodies are composed of materials that remain flexible, capable of compressing without breaking. Fluids within them are balanced with the pressure outside, preventing the kind of differential that would otherwise cause damage. In this way, their form becomes an extension of the environment itself, neither rigid nor hollow, but continuous with the force that surrounds it. Cells, at this depth, operate under conditions that would disrupt most biological systems found nearer the surface. Proteins, membranes, and chemical reactions all respond to pressure, and over long periods, life has adjusted at the smallest scales to remain stable. Molecular structures are configured to function despite compression, maintaining processes that would otherwise be slowed or altered. These adaptations are not visible in outward form, yet they define whether an organism can exist here at all. Movement within this environment reflects the same principles. Rapid motion, sharp changes in direction, or sudden bursts of energy become less common, not as a restriction imposed from outside, but as a consequence of operating within a medium that resists abrupt shifts. Bodies that are soft and pliable move with the surrounding water, conserving energy and reducing strain. Form follows function in a way that aligns closely with the conditions, each shape reflecting a balance between structure and pressure. Even the concept of size and density becomes adjusted. Some organisms appear delicate, almost insubstantial, yet they persist where stronger, more rigid forms would fail. Their strength lies not in resistance, but in accommodation, in the ability to exist without creating internal imbalances. What might seem fragile elsewhere becomes stable here, precisely because it does not rely on hardness or rigidity. This environment also influences how life maintains itself over time. Growth occurs without the need for reinforced frameworks, and repair processes adapt to conditions where compression is constant. The boundary between organism and environment becomes less defined as both operate under the same physical constraints. There is no clear separation between what presses and what is pressed, only a shared equilibrium that allows existence to continue. In this depth, pressure does not simply limit life, it defines it. Every structure, from the smallest molecular arrangement to the overall shape of an organism, reflects an ongoing adjustment to a force that never recedes. What emerges is not a version of life diminished by its surroundings, but one that has been formed entirely within them, shaped by compression into something that belongs precisely where it is. The earliest descents into these depths did not carry certainty with them, but a quiet expectation shaped by older assumptions about where life could and could not exist. For a long time, it had been understood that beyond a certain depth, the ocean would become too extreme to support complex organisms. Darkness without variation, pressure without relief, and limited energy sources suggested a boundary that life would not cross. When instruments were first lowered into these regions, they were not always intended to find thriving communities, but to confirm the absence of them. What returned from those early explorations did not align with that expectation. Instead of empty seafloor, recordings revealed movement, faint but unmistakable. Shapes appeared where none were predicted, drifting or resting against the sediment, responding to their surroundings in ways that indicated more than simple persistence. These were not isolated anomalies, but repeated observations that suggested a pattern, one that began to challenge the assumption that depth alone imposed a final limit. Initial reactions were measured, often cautious. Data from early missions could be incomplete, influenced by the limitations of equipment or the difficulty of maintaining stable observations. Some findings were questioned, not dismissed outright, but held at a distance until further confirmation could be obtained. The idea that complex life could exist under such conditions required careful verification, and so additional expeditions were planned, each one seeking clarity where uncertainty remained. As more evidence accumulated, the presence of life became increasingly difficult to interpret as anything other than real and consistent. Organisms were documented with greater detail, their forms captured through improved imaging and direct observation. They did not resemble the species known from shallower waters in any straightforward way. Their bodies appeared altered, shaped by conditions that differed so completely from those near the surface that familiar patterns no longer applied. Features common in other environments were reduced, absent, or replaced by structures that served entirely different purposes. These differences extended beyond appearance. Behavior followed a rhythm that seemed detached from the cycles observed above. Movement was often slow, deliberate, conserving energy in a setting where resources were not abundant. Interactions between organisms appeared infrequent, yet purposeful, shaped by the need to survive in a space where encounters could not be taken for granted. The environment did not support abundance in the same way as shallower regions, and so life adapted to operate within narrower margins. With each confirmed observation, the understanding of habitability began to shift. Conditions once thought to be prohibitive were reconsidered, not as barriers, but as parameters within which life could still function. The idea of where life might exist expanded, moving beyond the limits previously defined by light, temperature, and pressure. Instead, attention turned toward how organisms adapt to these factors, rather than whether they can endure them at all. This change in perspective extended beyond the trench itself. If life could exist here, in a place so far removed from earlier expectations, then similar environments elsewhere might also support forms of life not yet observed. The deep ocean became less of an endpoint and more of a continuum where different conditions produce different outcomes rather than absolute absence. What began as isolated findings gradually formed a broader understanding. The presence of life in these depths did not overturn earlier knowledge, but refined it, adding complexity to a system that had once been viewed in simpler terms. The trench, once considered a boundary, became part of a wider pattern where life persists not by avoiding extremes, but by adjusting to them in ways that are not always immediately recognizable. Light returns here, but not from above, and not in any steady or predictable way. It appears instead as brief, living signals, emerging from within the bodies of organisms that carry their own illumination through the dark. These glows are often small, sometimes no more than a faint pulse, yet in a place where no external light reaches, even the smallest source becomes significant. They do not fill the space or reveal its full shape, but they mark presence, movement, and intention in ways that would otherwise remain hidden. This ability, known as bioluminescence, arises from chemical reactions within specialized cells. Certain molecules interact with oxygen, releasing energy in the form of light rather than heat. The process is efficient, producing a glow that can be sustained or controlled depending on the organism. Some emit a steady radiance, while others produce flashes, brief and precise, timed to particular moments. The light itself can vary in color, though it often appears within a narrow range that travels effectively through the surrounding water. In this environment, light becomes a tool shaped by necessity. It is not used to illuminate the world in a broad sense, but to communicate, to attract, or to conceal. Some organisms produce light to draw others closer, creating a point of focus in the dark that suggests opportunity. The glow may resemble the faint movement of smaller prey, or simply stand out as something distinct in an otherwise featureless space. In approaching that signal, other organisms move toward what they interpret as a resource, unaware of the intent behind it. Other forms of light serve a different purpose, functioning as a warning or a disruption. Sudden flashes can startle nearby organisms, breaking patterns of movement or drawing attention away from the source. In some cases, light is released in a cloud, dispersing into the surrounding water and creating a temporary field of brightness that obscures the emitter's exact position. This brief expansion of light can create confusion, allowing the organism to move away without being followed. There are also patterns that appear more structured, sequences of pulses or steady glows arranged along the body. These may serve to identify members of the same species or to coordinate movement in a space where visibility is otherwise limited. The signals are not random but controlled, shaped by biological systems that regulate when and how light is produced. In this way, illumination becomes a language, expressed through timing and intensity rather than sound or form. Across the trench, these individual sources of light create a shifting landscape that exists only in fragments. No single glow reveals the full environment, yet together they form a dispersed network of signals, appearing and fading at different depths and distances. Movement becomes visible not through continuous illumination, but through these intermittent points, each one marking a presence that would otherwise remain unseen. The darkness is not replaced, but momentarily interrupted, revealing brief outlines of life within it. The presence of bioluminescence also reflects a broader adaptation to the conditions of this depth. In a place where external light is absent, the ability to generate illumination internally provides a means of interaction that would otherwise be unavailable. It allows organisms to influence their surroundings in subtle ways, shaping encounters and responses without altering the environment itself. The light does not belong to the space, but to the life within it, appearing only when produced and disappearing just as quickly. In this quiet exchange of signals, the deep ocean becomes a field of moving lights, each one temporary, each one purposeful, existing within a darkness that remains otherwise complete. Some forms of life do not announce their presence at all, even when they are close, even when they move. They exist in a way that allows them to pass through their surroundings without creating a clear outline, their bodies offering little resistance to light and, in many cases, little contrast against the water itself. In these depths, where visibility is already limited, this approach becomes especially effective, not through concealment alone, but through near absence of appearance. Many of these organisms are partially or almost entirely transparent. Their tissues lack the pigments that would otherwise give them color, allowing light, when it is present, to pass through with minimal scattering. Internal structures are often faintly visible, suspended within a body that seems more like a shifting boundary than a solid form. Muscles, organs, and channels appear as soft variations within a nearly invisible frame, moving slowly as the organism drifts or adjusts its position. This transparency is not accidental, but a direct result of the environment. Pigmentation, which serves purposes such as protection from sunlight or visual signaling in other regions, becomes unnecessary where external light is absent. Over time, the production of these pigments diminishes, reducing the energy required to maintain them. What remains is a form that reflects efficiency, where anything not essential to survival gradually recedes. The benefit of this near invisibility extends beyond appearance. In a space where encounters are infrequent and often unpredictable, avoiding detection becomes a stable strategy. Without a defined silhouette, these organisms present little for others to recognize. Movement does not create a strong visual cue, and the absence of color prevents them from standing out against any brief illumination that might occur. Even when another organism passes nearby, the transparent form may remain unnoticed unless it directly intersects with the observer's path. Their bodies are often delicate, composed of soft materials that respond easily to surrounding currents. Rather than resisting the movement of water, they move with it, drifting slowly through the environment. This reduces the energy required for active motion, allowing them to persist in a setting where resources are limited. Their structure is not built for speed or force, but for continuity, maintaining form while adapting to subtle changes in flow. Some possess extended appendages or thin membranes that increase their surface area, aiding in buoyancy and stability. These features remain nearly invisible as well, expanding outward without creating a defined edge. The organism becomes a presence that is difficult to separate from its surroundings, its boundaries blending into the water in a way that reduces both visibility and disturbance. In certain moments, when external light briefly reaches them, or when another organism emits its own glow, their forms become faintly outlined, appearing for an instant before fading again. These glimpses reveal complexity within simplicity, structures that are carefully arranged yet rarely seen in full. The transparency does not remove detail, but conceals it, allowing the organism to exist without drawing attention. This approach to survival reflects a different kind of adaptation, one that does not rely on strength, speed, or even active concealment. Instead, it is based on reduction, on becoming less visible by becoming less defined. The organism does not hide behind structures or within the environment, but becomes part of it, its presence merging with the surrounding water until distinction becomes difficult to maintain. In this way, life in these depths can exist without leaving a clear trace, moving through the environment with minimal interruption. It is not absence, but a form of presence that remains subtle, shaped by conditions where being seen offers little advantage and where remaining nearly invisible allows existence to continue without conflict. Encounters here are infrequent, separated by long stretches of movement where nothing interrupts the surrounding stillness. In such conditions, the act of finding food is not a routine event, but an uncommon convergence, shaped by chance and patience rather than pursuit. Predators that exist within this environment do not rely on frequent success, but on the ability to endure long intervals between opportunities, conserving energy until a moment presents itself. Their bodies reflect this necessity in ways that differ from those found in more abundant regions. Many possess disproportionately large jaws, capable of opening far beyond what their size might suggest. These structures are not designed for repeated feeding, but for rare moments when capturing and consuming a substantial meal becomes essential. The ability to take in prey larger than themselves allows them to make use of infrequent encounters, storing energy that must last for extended periods. Along with this, their internal systems are adapted to accommodate sudden intake. Stomachs can expand significantly, stretching to hold food that may not be encountered again for some time. Digestion proceeds slowly, allowing nutrients to be absorbed over longer durations, extending the usefulness of a single feeding event. This gradual processing aligns with an environment where regular intake cannot be assumed and where efficiency determines survival. Movement, in this context, becomes restrained. Rapid swimming or continuous searching would expend energy without guarantee of success. Instead, many predators adopt a strategy of waiting, positioning themselves within the water or along the seafloor, remaining still for long intervals. This stillness is not passive, but deliberate, maintaining readiness while minimizing energy use. The surrounding environment carries subtle signals, vibrations, or chemical traces that indicate the presence of another organism, and these cues guide the timing of action. When movement does occur, it is often brief and precise. A sudden extension, a controlled shift, or a quick closure of jaws replaces prolonged pursuit. The goal is not to chase, but to intercept, using minimal effort to secure the available opportunity. This approach reduces unnecessary expenditure, aligning action with the rare moments when it is most likely to succeed. The forms of these predators often appear unusual, shaped by the demands of their environment rather than by symmetry or balance. Heads may seem oversized in relation to the body, mouths extending in ways that appear disproportionate. Teeth, when present, are arranged to secure rather than process, holding prey firmly once captured. These features are not excessive, but necessary, reflecting a design where each successful encounter must be maximized. In some cases, sensory systems are heightened to detect the faintest indications of nearby movement. Subtle changes in water pressure, slight disturbances, or traces of chemical presence can signal an approaching organism. These signals are often the only indicators available, and the ability to interpret them accurately allows predators to respond without expending energy on constant motion. The environment does not provide frequent visual cues, and so detection relies on forms of perception that operate beyond sight. The rhythm of life here is shaped by these patterns. Feeding is not a daily occurrence, but an event that punctuates long periods of waiting. Growth and maintenance proceed at a pace that reflects this scarcity, with energy allocated carefully across time. Predators do not dominate through speed or strength alone, but through alignment with the conditions that define their surroundings. In this way, survival becomes less about constant activity and more about restraint. The ability to remain still, to act only when necessary, and to make full use of each rare opportunity defines these organisms. Their presence is not marked by frequent movement, but by the quiet persistence of forms adapted to a world where encounters are few, and each one carries significance. Form begins to loosen here, as if the idea of a fixed shape has been set aside in favor of something more adaptable, more responsive to the conditions that surround it. Bodies no longer follow the balanced proportions seen in shallower waters, where symmetry and structure often reflect movement through open space and light. Instead, shapes appear stretched, compressed, or rearranged, guided by forces that favor flexibility over rigidity. What emerges is a collection of forms that seem unfamiliar, not because they are random, but because they are shaped by a different set of priorities. Some organisms carry elongated bodies that taper unevenly, their outlines shifting gently with the movement of the water. Others appear compact yet soft, lacking the firm edges that would define them more clearly. Proportions can seem exaggerated, with heads, mouths, or appendages extending beyond what might be expected, yet each feature serves a purpose aligned with the environment. These shapes are not designed for speed or display, but for persistence within a space that applies constant pressure from all directions. The materials that compose these bodies reflect this need for adaptability. Many are gelatinous, their tissues composed largely of water, supported by minimal structural reinforcement. This composition allows them to maintain form without resisting the surrounding pressure, compressing and expanding in subtle ways without damage. Their surfaces may appear smooth and translucent, lacking the layered complexity seen in more rigid organisms. Yet beneath that simplicity lies a structure finely tuned to its conditions. In the absence of strong skeletal systems, support comes from within the fluid balance of the body itself. Internal pressure aligns with the external environment, creating a state where collapse is avoided not through resistance, but through equilibrium. Bones, where they exist, are often reduced or less dense, serving limited roles rather than forming a dominant framework. This shift allows the organism to remain stable without the need for rigid support, adapting its form to match the forces acting upon it. Movement within such bodies is subtle, often flowing rather than segmented. Muscles contract in waves or gentle pulses, producing motion that blends with the surrounding currents. There is little emphasis on rapid propulsion and more on maintaining position or adjusting slowly through the water. Appendages, when present, are flexible and responsive, extending or folding without creating sharp boundaries. The overall effect is one of continuity, where the organism's form and movement align closely with the medium it inhabits. These physical differences reflect a broader pattern of adaptation. In environments shaped by light, bodies often evolve to interact visually through color, pattern, or defined structure. Here, where light does not guide development, those features lose their significance. Instead, pressure becomes the primary influence, shaping form in ways that prioritize stability and efficiency. The result is a set of characteristics that may appear unusual when compared to familiar organisms, yet are entirely consistent within their context. Even sensory structures follow this pattern. Organs that rely on light are diminished or altered, while others that detect movement or chemical presence take on greater importance. The body becomes a system oriented toward interaction with its immediate surroundings rather than distant visual cues. Each element, from overall shape to internal composition, reflects a balance between function and environment. Over time, these adaptations accumulate, producing organisms that do not resemble those found elsewhere, yet are fully suited to their conditions. Their forms may seem unexpected, but they are not without logic. They represent a different pathway of development, one guided not by visibility or speed, but by the quiet, persistent influence of pressure, shaping life into forms that belong precisely where they exist. Scale becomes uncertain here, not because it is undefined, but because it stretches across extremes that exist side by side without transition. Within the same expanse, some organisms grow far larger than their relatives elsewhere, while others remain so small they are nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding particles drifting through the water. This contrast is not accidental, but shaped by the same conditions that influence every aspect of life at these depths. Certain species exhibit what is often described as deep-sea gigantism, where individuals reach sizes that appear disproportionate when compared to similar organisms in shallower environments. Limbs extend further, bodies broaden, and overall mass increases in ways that suggest a different balance between growth and survival. This enlargement is not uniform across all forms of life, but appears selectively, influenced by factors such as metabolism, lifespan, and the availability of energy over extended periods. In contrast, other organisms remain extremely small, existing at scales that require magnification to be fully observed. These forms often consist of simple structures, their bodies reduced to essential components that allow them to function with minimal energy. They drift or settle within the environment, interacting with chemical gradients and microscopic particles, forming a layer of life that is present throughout the trench, though rarely visible in a direct sense. The coexistence of these extremes reflects the constraints imposed by limited resources. Energy does not circulate here in the same way it does in more productive regions. Nutrients arrive sporadically, often in the form of organic material, descending from above or redistributed through slow currents. This irregular supply creates conditions where different strategies for growth emerge, each adapted to make use of what is available in distinct ways. Larger organisms may benefit from increased size through extended lifespans and greater capacity to store energy. Their bodies can sustain them through longer intervals between feeding opportunities, allowing them to persist in an environment where encounters with food are not frequent. Growth, in this case, becomes a form of stability, a way to buffer against the unpredictability of supply. The process unfolds gradually, with development occurring over extended periods rather than rapid cycles. Smaller organisms, on the other hand, operate under a different set of advantages. Their reduced size allows them to require less energy overall, enabling them to survive on minimal resources. They can occupy spaces and utilize materials that larger organisms cannot, forming a continuous presence within the environment. Their reproduction may occur more frequently, though on a smaller scale, maintaining populations that remain steady despite the limitations of their surroundings. These contrasting strategies do not compete directly, but instead occupy different layers of the same system. Larger forms move through broader spaces, interacting with the environment in ways that involve greater distances and longer timescales. Smaller forms remain closely tied to immediate conditions, responding quickly to localized changes and maintaining processes that operate continuously. Temperature, pressure, and the absence of light also contribute to how size is expressed. Slower metabolic rates can support larger body sizes in some cases, as energy is used more gradually. In other instances, the same conditions favor reduction, where simplicity allows for efficiency. The outcome is not a single pattern, but a range of possibilities shaped by how each organism interacts with its environment. In this shared space, size becomes one of many variables through which life adapts, rather than a fixed trait. The presence of both immense and minute forms reflects a balance between scarcity and persistence, where growth and reduction each offer viable paths. What emerges is a system where scale does not follow a single direction, but expands and contracts in response to the same underlying conditions, allowing a wide range of forms to exist within the same quiet depths. Before anything is seen, it is often sensed as a shift, a faint disturbance carried through the water long before contact occurs. In this environment, where visual reference offers little guidance, perception begins with movement that cannot be observed directly, but travels through the surrounding medium with quiet consistency. Water conducts these signals efficiently, allowing even small vibrations to move outward across considerable distances, reaching organisms that rely on them as their primary connection to the world around them. Sound, in this sense, is not limited to what might be recognized as a distinct noise, but includes a broad range of pressure variations moving through the water. These waves travel faster and farther here than they would through air, maintaining their structure over extended ranges. A distant movement, the shift of sediment, or the motion of another organism creates patterns that spread outward, forming a continuous field of information. Within this field, each variation carries detail about direction, intensity, and origin, allowing those attuned to interpret it with precision. Many organisms possess structures designed to detect these subtle changes. Instead of relying on eyes, they sense differences in pressure, responding to gradients that indicate proximity and movement. Some use specialized cells distributed along their bodies, while others rely on internal systems that translate vibrations into signals that guide behavior. These mechanisms allow them to locate other organisms, navigate the terrain, and respond to changes without requiring light. The environment itself contributes to a constant background of motion. Currents shift slowly, interacting with the contours of the seafloor, creating low-frequency vibrations that remain present over time. Particles settling through the water introduce faint disturbances, while interactions between organisms add intermittent layers to the surrounding field. Together, these elements form a soundscape that is continuous, though often subtle, shaping how life perceives its surroundings. Within this ongoing pattern, certain signals stand out. Sudden movements produce sharper variations, distinct from the steady flow of background vibrations. These can indicate the presence of a nearby organism or an event that requires response. The ability to distinguish between these signals becomes essential, allowing organisms to act selectively rather than reacting to every fluctuation. Over time, this selectivity refines behavior, aligning responses with the most relevant information available. Recorded observations from exploratory equipment have revealed sounds that do not always correspond to easily identifiable sources. Low-frequency pulses, rhythmic sequences, and brief bursts have been detected, traveling through the water with no immediate visual counterpart. Some of these can be traced to geological activity, such as the movement of the seafloor or the release of tension along fractures. Others appear linked to biological sources, though their exact origin is not always clear. These recordings provide a glimpse into a layer of the environment that operates independently of sight. For the organisms that inhabit this space, these signals are not unusual, but part of a continuous stream of information. What may seem indistinct or ambiguous to external observation is interpreted within the context of their sensory systems. The absence of light does not reduce awareness, but shifts it toward forms of perception that operate through contact with the medium itself. movement, presence, and change are all conveyed through variations in pressure, creating a map that exists not in images, but in patterns. In this way, the trench becomes an environment defined as much by what is felt as by what exists physically. Sound, in its broadest sense, replaces vision as a means of connection, allowing life to interact with its surroundings through signals that move quietly and persistently through the water. The ground below does not appear suddenly, but emerges slowly from the darkness as a muted surface, faintly revealed when illumination reaches it. What first comes into view is not a sharp boundary, but a gradual texture, soft and uneven, extending outward in subtle variations. The seafloor here is composed largely of fine sediment, particles that have settled over long periods, descending from above in a continuous, nearly imperceptible drift. These layers accumulate without disturbance for extended intervals, forming a surface that appears smooth at a distance, yet reveals delicate patterns upon closer observation. This sediment is not uniform. In some areas, it gathers into gentle slopes, shaped by the slow movement of water and the contours of the underlying terrain. In others, it thins, exposing firmer structures beneath, where rock formations rise through the softer material. These formations do not form abrupt peaks, but rather low ridges and irregular elevations, marking places where the Earth's crust has shifted or where sediment has not fully settled. The transitions between these features are gradual, creating a landscape defined by subtle changes rather than sharp contrasts. As submersibles approach the seafloor, their lights reveal these details in narrow beams, illuminating only a small portion of the surroundings at any given time. Beyond that limited field, the environment remains concealed, extending outward into darkness. The illuminated area often appears undisturbed, with no immediate sign of movement. The sediment lies in place, its surface unbroken except for occasional markings left by passing organisms or the faint impressions of settling particles. The stillness of this landscape is notable, not as an absence of activity, but as a reflection of the slow processes that define it. Changes occur over extended periods, with layers building gradually and structures shifting almost imperceptibly. There is no visible motion in the way it might be recognized elsewhere, yet the environment is not static. It evolves continuously, shaped by forces that operate beyond immediate observation. In certain regions, the seafloor reveals signs of past movement, subtle disruptions where sediment has been displaced or where small ridges indicate underlying shifts. These features do not suggest sudden change, but rather the accumulation of minor adjustments over time. The terrain holds a record of these processes, though it does so quietly, without dramatic expression. Submersibles, moving across this surface, encounter a landscape that is both expansive and confined. Their lights define a temporary boundary within which detail becomes visible, while everything beyond remains undefined. The sensation is not of traveling across a fully revealed environment, but of passing through a series of brief exposures, each one offering a limited view before fading back into obscurity. Navigation relies on instruments as much as observation, as the visible field does not extend far enough to provide a complete sense of direction or scale. Occasionally, objects or formations appear within this illuminated space, emerging gradually as the submersible approaches. These may include clusters of rock, slight depressions, or variations in sediment texture. Each feature is encountered in isolation, without the broader context that would connect it to the larger structure of the trench. The environment reveals itself in fragments, each one part of a wider landscape that remains largely unseen. In this setting, the seafloor does not present itself as a continuous scene, but as a sequence of moments, each defined by the reach of artificial light. The underlying terrain extends far beyond these brief glimpses, maintaining its form regardless of whether it is observed. What is visible becomes only a small portion of what exists, a narrow window into a landscape that continues, quiet and unchanged, across the depths. Far below the drifting sediments and quiet contours, the ground does not remain entirely still. It holds a tension that is not visible from above, yet persists as a slow accumulation within the structure of the Earth itself. The boundary that defines this trench is not only a feature of shape, but of motion, where vast sections of the planet press against one another with steady, unrelenting force. The North American plate continues its gradual descent beneath the Caribbean plate, moving at a pace that would seem imperceptible over short spans of time. This motion does not occur smoothly. Friction along the boundary resists the movement, causing portions of the plates to lock together temporarily. As they remain in contact, pressure builds, not evenly, but in concentrated regions where the surfaces press most tightly against each other. The surrounding rock begins to store this energy, held in place until the resistance can no longer be maintained. When that threshold is reached, the stored energy is released in a sudden shift. The plates move abruptly, adjusting their position by a small amount, yet releasing energy that travels outward through the earth. These waves move through solid rock and sediment, carrying the disturbance across considerable distances. At the seafloor, the effect is subtle in appearance, often producing only slight displacements or changes in the arrangement of sediment. Yet the event itself represents a significant redistribution of energy beneath the surface. The surrounding water responds to these movements, transmitting the energy in different forms. Vibrations pass upward, interacting with the layers above, while the structure of the seafloor may shift slightly, altering the contours that define the trench. These changes are not always immediately visible, but they contribute to the ongoing evolution of the landscape, marking points where the balance of forces has adjusted. In regions above the trench, the effects of these events can extend further. Seismic waves travel through the crust, reaching areas far removed from the original movement. On land, this may be felt as a tremor, a brief motion that reflects the deeper activity occurring beneath the ocean. The connection between the trench and the surrounding regions becomes apparent through these events, linking distant areas through the transmission of energy. The frequency of these occurrences varies, with some movements releasing only small amounts of energy, while others involve more significant shifts. Each event represents a moment in an ongoing process where stress is accumulated and released repeatedly over time. The trench does not remain static, but continues to adjust as the plates interact, shaping the structure of the boundary through these periodic movements. Within the depths themselves, these events unfold without visible disturbance to the broader environment. Life continues in proximity to these shifts, adapted to conditions where the ground beneath may change without warning. The organisms that inhabit this space are not insulated from these processes, yet their forms and behaviors persist within a setting that includes such variability as part of its nature. The presence of these movements also contributes to the complexity of the trench's structure. Fractures and variations in the seafloor reflect past events, marking where the crust has shifted and adjusted. Over long periods, these changes accumulate, influencing the shape and composition of the environment. The trench becomes not only a feature of depth, but a record of motion, where each adjustment leaves a subtle trace within the larger formation. In this way, The Earth continues its slow reconfiguration beneath the ocean, guided by forces that operate beyond immediate perception. The darkness above does not quiet these processes, but simply conceals them, allowing movement and change to proceed without visible indication, shaping the trench from below while the surface remains undisturbed. At certain moments, the seafloor does more than shift within itself. It transfers motion upward, carrying the effect of its movement into the water above. When a section of the ocean floor is displaced, even by a small vertical change, the water resting upon it must adjust. This adjustment does not remain localized. It spreads outward, forming a series of waves that travel across the surface, often with little indication of their origin once they begin to move away from the source. These waves do not resemble the familiar patterns seen near shore. In the open ocean, they can extend across vast distances with long wavelengths and low visible height, passing beneath vessels without immediate notice. The energy they carry is distributed across depth, moving as a continuous pulse through the water column. It is only when they approach shallower regions that their form changes, the energy compressing upward, increasing in height as the water depth decreases. The connection between movement at the seafloor and motion at the surface reflects a direct relationship between the deep ocean and the coastlines that border it. When the underlying structure shifts, the water responds as a single body, transmitting that change across distances that may span entire ocean basins. The trench, though distant from land in physical depth, remains linked to regions above through this capacity for energy transfer. In the region surrounding the Puerto Rico Trench, historical records have noted events where seismic activity has led to measurable changes along nearby coasts. Past occurrences have demonstrated that disturbances originating beneath the ocean can produce waves that reach land with noticeable force. These events are not constant, but they illustrate the potential for interaction between the deep environment and surface conditions, reinforcing the need to understand the processes involved. Monitoring systems have been established to observe these dynamics, using instruments placed both on the seafloor and at the surface. These systems track seismic activity, changes in pressure, and variations in water movement, providing data that can indicate when a significant shift has occurred. The information collected is used to assess whether a disturbance has the potential to generate waves that may travel toward populated regions. This monitoring does not prevent the events themselves, but it allows for awareness and response based on observed conditions. The trench's position near inhabited islands contributes to the attention it receives. Its proximity means that any significant movement beneath it has a relatively short distance to travel before reaching coastal areas. This reduces the time between the initial event and its potential effects at the surface, making early detection and interpretation of data particularly important. The relationship between depth and distance becomes a factor in how these events are understood and managed. At the same time, not every movement produces a wave of consequence. Many shifts occur without generating significant displacement of water, their effects remaining confined to the structure of the seafloor. The conditions required to produce a wave capable of traveling outward involve specific combinations of movement, depth, and orientation. Understanding these factors remains an ongoing process, informed by both observation and analysis. Within the trench itself, these processes unfold without visible indication at the moment they begin. The displacement of the seafloor, the adjustment of water above, and the outward movement of energy all occur beneath the surface, beyond direct observation. Yet their influence extends upward and outward, linking the deepest parts of the ocean to the edges of land. The connection is continuous, shaped by the same forces that define the trench, carrying motion from one environment into another without interruption. Temperature here is not uniform, though it appears so at first. The surrounding water remains consistently cold, holding its low temperature with little variation across depth and distance. Yet in certain places along the seafloor, that stillness is interrupted by narrow openings where heat rises from below, carried upward through fractures in the Earth's crust. These points are not widespread, but where they occur, they introduce a distinct contrast within an otherwise steady environment. Hydrothermal activity begins beneath the surface of the seafloor, where water seeps downward through cracks and porous rock. As it descends, it encounters regions warmed by the internal heat of the planet, increasing in temperature as it moves deeper. This heated water interacts with surrounding minerals, dissolving and carrying them along as it is forced back upward through the same pathways. When it emerges again at the seafloor, it does so as a concentrated flow, releasing both heat and chemical compounds into the surrounding water. These venting fluids differ significantly from the cold environment around them. Temperatures can rise sharply within a confined space, creating localized zones where the water is far warmer than the surrounding depths. The contrast is immediate, not gradual, forming boundaries where temperature shifts over very short distances. The heated fluid rises briefly before dispersing, mixing with the colder water and gradually losing its intensity as it moves away from the source. Along with heat, these fluids carry dissolved elements such as metals and reduced compounds, including hydrogen, sulfide, and methane. When released into the surrounding water, they create chemical gradients that extend outward from the vent. These gradients do not spread evenly, but form patterns influenced by currents and the structure of the seafloor. Within these patterns, conditions differ from the broader environment, providing localized areas where chemical energy is available in forms not present elsewhere. Life in these regions gathers in response to these conditions. Organisms that are able to utilize the chemical compounds released from the vents form the foundation of these communities. Rather than relying on external light, they derive energy from chemical reactions, converting available compounds into forms that sustain biological processes. This approach supports a network of interactions, where different organisms occupy positions within the same localized system. The distribution of life around these vents reflects the balance between heat, chemical availability, and the surrounding cold water. Some organisms remain close to the source, where conditions are more intense, while others position themselves at varying distances where the environment becomes less extreme. This creates a gradient of habitation with different forms adapted to specific ranges within the overall system. Movement between these zones is limited, as each region presents conditions that not all organisms can tolerate. The structures formed around vents often differ from the surrounding seafloor. Mineral deposits accumulate as the heated fluids cool and react with the seawater, creating formations that rise above the sediment. These structures can alter local currents and provide surfaces for organisms to attach or gather, further shaping the distribution of life within the area. The environment becomes more complex, not through large-scale variation, but through the presence of these concentrated features. Beyond these zones, the seafloor returns to its broader state, with temperature and chemical composition remaining relatively stable. The vents, while significant, occupy only small portions of the trench, yet their influence extends through the life they support. They introduce variation into an otherwise uniform environment, creating pockets where different processes occur. In this way, Heat exists within a predominantly cold world, not as a widespread condition, but as a series of localized expressions. These areas do not alter the overall nature of the trench, but they provide distinct environments where life can gather and persist through mechanisms that differ from those found elsewhere in the depths. Energy here does not arrive from above, and it does not follow a cycle tied to any distant source. Instead, it emerges from within the environment itself, carried through interactions between water and the materials beneath the seafloor. In certain regions, chemical compounds rise into the surrounding water, forming the basis of a different kind of process, one that allows life to exist without relying on light at all. At the center of this process is chemosynthesis, a way of producing energy that depends on chemical reactions rather than sunlight. Certain microorganisms are able to take compounds such as hydrogen sulfide or methane and, through internal reactions, convert them into usable energy. This transformation does not involve light or photosynthesis, but instead draws directly from the chemical differences present in the environment. The result is a steady source of energy that remains available as long as these compounds continue to circulate. These microorganisms form the foundation of entire communities. They occupy surfaces near the source of these chemicals, clustering along mineral deposits or within the surrounding sediment. Their activity supports other forms of life, creating a system where energy moves outward from a central process rather than downward from an external one. Organisms that cannot produce energy in this way rely on those that can, feeding on them directly or forming relationships that allow for the exchange of resources. In some cases, larger organisms host these microorganisms within their own bodies, creating a close association where both benefit from the arrangement. The host provides access to chemical compounds, while the microorganisms produce energy that supports the host's survival. This form of interaction reflects a balance that is shaped by the conditions of the environment, where cooperation becomes a stable strategy in the absence of more familiar energy sources. The structure of these ecosystems differs from those found in regions where sunlight drives primary production. Instead of a broad distribution of energy across wide areas, these systems are often concentrated, forming around specific locations where the necessary chemicals are present. Life gathers in these zones, creating localized communities that depend on the continuous availability of chemical energy. Outside of these areas, the same forms may not persist, as the conditions required to support them are not present. The existence of such systems alters how life is understood in relation to its environment. The absence of sunlight does not represent a boundary beyond which life cannot function, but rather a shift in the processes that sustain it. Energy can be derived from multiple sources, and the presence of chemical gradients provides an alternative pathway that allows biological systems to operate independently of light. This realization extends beyond the immediate environment of the trench. It suggests that life may exist in other places where similar chemical conditions occur, even in the absence of sunlight. The requirements for life become less restricted to surface conditions, expanding to include environments that were once considered unlikely to support biological activity. The focus shifts from the presence of light to the availability of energy in any form that can be utilized. Within the trench, these systems continue to operate quietly, converting chemical potential into biological activity without drawing attention to themselves. The organisms involved do not depend on cycles of day and night, but on the steady flow of compounds through their environment. Their existence reflects a different relationship between life and energy, one that is sustained by processes occurring deep within the earth rather than by external illumination. In this way, life without sunlight does not appear as an exception, but as a variation, one that demonstrates how biological systems adapt to the conditions available to them, drawing energy from sources that extend beyond the familiar. Time moves differently here, not because it changes, but because life responds to it with a different rhythm. Processes that might unfold quickly elsewhere extend across longer spans, guided by the steady limitations of the environment. Energy is not readily available, and so it is used with restraint, shaping patterns of survival that favor endurance over immediacy. Metabolism slows to match this pace. Chemical reactions within the body proceed at reduced rates, conserving energy by limiting unnecessary expenditure. Growth becomes gradual, often unfolding over extended periods rather than rapid cycles. Movement aligns with this reduced demand, occurring only when required, allowing organisms to maintain stability without drawing heavily on limited resources. This slowing is not a disadvantage, but an adjustment that allows life to persist within narrow margins. Lifespan follows a similar pattern. Many organisms endure for long durations, their existence extending far beyond what might be expected in more dynamic environments. With fewer opportunities for rapid growth or frequent reproduction, continuity is maintained through longevity. Individuals persist, carrying their biological processes forward over time, rather than relying on constant replacement. This approach reflects a balance between survival and renewal, where stability is achieved through duration rather than abundance. Reproduction, in turn, becomes infrequent. Opportunities to produce offspring are limited, shaped by the availability of energy and the presence of suitable conditions. When reproduction does occur, it is often carefully timed, aligned with moments when resources are sufficient to support new life. The number of offspring may be small, but each represents a significant investment, reflecting the constraints under which life operates. This approach reduces the risk of overextension, ensuring that energy remains available for survival. These strategies are interconnected, forming a system where each element supports the others. A slower metabolism allows for longer lifespan, which in turn reduces the need for frequent reproduction. Limited reproduction ensures that resources are not depleted, maintaining conditions that support continued existence. The system does not rely on rapid change or expansion, but on maintaining equilibrium over time. Efficiency becomes the central principle guiding these adaptations. Energy is allocated with precision, directed toward essential processes while minimizing waste. Structures and behaviors evolve to reduce unnecessary expenditure, allowing organisms to function within the limits imposed by their environment. This efficiency is not achieved through simplification alone, but through careful alignment with the conditions present, ensuring that each action contributes to survival. Interactions between organisms also reflect this pattern. Encounters are not frequent, and so responses are measured, avoiding unnecessary conflict or competition. The environment does not support constant activity, and so life adapts by reducing its reliance on it. Presence is maintained without excess, allowing multiple forms to exist within the same space without overwhelming the available resources. Over time, these strategies shape a community that operates at a steady, unhurried pace. Change occurs, but it does so gradually, guided by processes that extend across long durations. The absence of urgency allows for stability, where life persists through careful balance rather than rapid adaptation. In this setting, survival is not defined by speed or dominance, but by the ability to endure within constraints. Each organism reflects a set of choices shaped by the environment, favoring continuity over expansion and efficiency over excess. The result is a system where life remains present, sustained by strategies that align closely with the conditions that define it. Records from these depths often begin as fragments, brief encounters captured in passing before the environment closes in again. A form appears within the narrow reach of a submersible's instruments, moving or resting just long enough to be noted, then disappearing as the vehicle continues its path. In many cases, these observations remain singular, not because the organism exists only once, but because the conditions required to encounter it again are difficult to recreate with precision. The trench does not present fixed pathways or easily marked locations. Its structure shifts gradually, and even small variations in position can lead to entirely different surroundings. Returning to an exact point within this landscape requires navigation across distances where visual reference is limited and where mapping, though improving, still lacks complete detail. Instruments guide the descent, but the margin between one location and another can be subtle, making repeated visits to the same precise spot uncertain. Because of this, many organisms have been recorded only once. A single image, a short sequence of movement, or a brief collection of data becomes the entirety of what is known about them. These records provide enough information to confirm their existence, yet not enough to fully understand their behavior, distribution, or role within the environment. Each observation stands alone, offering a glimpse rather than a complete picture. Documentation itself is shaped by these limitations. Equipment must operate within strict constraints, balancing the need for observation with the requirements of maintaining function at depth. Cameras, sensors, and sampling tools capture what they can within the available time, but coverage remains partial. Lighting reveals only a small portion of the surroundings, and movement is controlled, preventing rapid shifts in focus. As a result, much of what exists remains outside the field of observation, not because it is absent, but because it has not yet been encountered. These singular observations suggest a broader presence that extends beyond what has been recorded. If an organism appears once within a limited exploration, it is likely part of a wider population distributed across areas that have not been directly observed. The trench, with its extensive and varied terrain, provides space for such distributions, allowing species to exist across regions that remain unvisited. Each isolated sighting hints at a larger pattern, one that is not yet fully mapped. The possibility of unknown biodiversity emerges from this pattern of partial knowledge. The number of species present within the trench may be far greater than current records indicate, with many forms remaining undocumented due to the challenges of exploration. The environment does not reveal itself uniformly, and so discovery occurs in increments, each addition expanding the known range, while leaving gaps that continue to persist. Even when attempts are made to locate previously observed species, the outcome is not always consistent. Changes in local conditions, slight variations in position, or the movement of the organisms themselves can prevent a second encounter. The absence of repeated sightings does not indicate disappearance, but reflects the difficulty of aligning multiple variables within a complex and dynamic environment. In this way, the trench holds a collection of life that is only partially revealed, with each observation representing a point within a much larger system. The organisms that have been seen once remain part of that system, their presence confirmed, yet not fully understood. What is known continues to expand slowly, shaped by each descent, while what remains unseen extends beyond those boundaries, existing within the same depths, waiting without urgency to be encountered again. Behavior here does not always follow patterns that align with familiar expectations, even when the surrounding conditions appear consistent. Movements can seem irregular, sequences unfolding without the clear purpose or efficiency often associated with survival. An organism may drift, pause, then shift direction without an apparent trigger, its path tracing slow arcs through the water as if guided by signals not immediately visible. These patterns do not reflect randomness, but they resist simple interpretation, shaped by influences that remain partially hidden. Some movements appear almost deliberate in their restraint. Rather than direct approaches or clear avoidance, organisms may circle, hover, or maintain distance for extended periods before acting. This creates interactions that unfold gradually, with changes occurring over long intervals rather than sudden adjustments. The absence of urgency does not indicate a lack of awareness, but suggests that timing operates under a different set of priorities, where action is delayed until conditions align in ways not always evident. Light, when produced, is not always used in predictable ways. Instead of consistent signaling or direct attraction, some organisms emit brief, irregular pulses that do not form obvious patterns. These flashes may appear isolated, then repeat at varying intervals, creating sequences that are difficult to interpret from an external perspective. In some cases, light is emitted without any immediate interaction following it, suggesting functions that extend beyond simple communication or predation. The signals may serve multiple roles simultaneously or operate within systems that are not yet fully understood. Feeding behavior also reflects this complexity. Rather than immediate consumption upon encountering potential food, some organisms engage in actions that appear indirect. They may manipulate their surroundings, disturb sediment, or release substances into the water before feeding occurs. These steps can seem inefficient when viewed in isolation, yet they may be part of processes that increase the likelihood of success over time. The sequence of actions may alter the environment in subtle ways, making resources more accessible or detectable. In other instances, organisms appear to interact with potential food sources without consuming them immediately, maintaining proximity or contact before acting. This extended engagement may serve to assess or prepare the resource, though the exact mechanisms are not always clear. The delay introduces a layer of complexity, where feeding is not a single action, but a sequence that unfolds over time, shaped by factors that are not fully visible. These behaviors often resist clear classification, as they do not fit neatly into established categories of hunting, communication, or navigation. Instead, they occupy a space where multiple functions may overlap, each influencing the others. An action that appears to serve one purpose may also contribute to another, creating patterns that are difficult to separate into distinct roles. The environment, with its limited visibility and dispersed signals, may favor such multifunctional behaviors, allowing organisms to respond flexibly to changing conditions. Observation of these patterns is further limited by the conditions under which they are recorded. Encounters are brief, and the context surrounding each behavior is not always fully captured. Without continuous observation, sequences may appear incomplete, leaving gaps in understanding. What is seen represents only a portion of a larger process, one that extends beyond the moment of observation. Over time, these behaviors suggest that life in this environment operates through systems that are more intricate than they first appear. Actions are not always optimized for immediate efficiency, but may reflect strategies that balance multiple constraints. The result is a set of behaviors that, while unfamiliar, are consistent within their context, shaped by an environment where signals are subtle, resources are limited, and interaction unfolds at a pace that reveals itself only gradually. Reaching this depth begins not in the water, but in the careful construction of a vessel that can exist where ordinary materials fail. Every element of a submersible is shaped by the need to endure constant pressure, not from a single direction, but from all sides at once. The outer structure is often formed as a sphere or a similarly balanced shape, distributing force evenly to prevent collapse. Thick walls, reinforced joints, and precisely engineered seals work together to maintain a stable interior, allowing instruments and, in some cases, people to function within conditions that would otherwise be uninhabitable. Inside these vessels, space is limited, arranged to support essential systems while minimizing excess. Controls, sensors, and communication equipment are integrated into a compact environment where each component must operate reliably despite the surrounding conditions. External lights, cameras, and sampling tools extend the reach of the submersible, allowing it to interact with its surroundings without compromising its structural integrity. Movement is controlled through thrusters that provide slow, deliberate adjustments, guiding the vessel through terrain that cannot be seen beyond the range of its own illumination. Manned missions carry individuals directly into this environment, placing them within a protective boundary that separates them from the external pressure. These descents offer the advantage of immediate observation, allowing those inside to respond in real time to what they encounter. Decisions can be made without delay, and subtle details may be noticed that automated systems might overlook. However, this approach also introduces significant risk, as the safety of those inside depends entirely on the integrity of the vessel and the reliability of its systems. Unmanned missions remove this direct human presence, relying instead on remotely operated or autonomous vehicles. These systems can descend for longer periods, extending the duration of observation beyond what is possible with crewed missions. They are controlled from the surface or follow pre-programmed paths, collecting data and imagery that can be analyzed later. Without the need to support human life, they can be smaller or more specialized, designed for specific tasks such as mapping, sampling, or extended monitoring. Each approach reflects a balance between capability and limitation. Manned missions provide immediacy and adaptability, while unmanned systems offer endurance and reduced risk to human life. Both are constrained by the same environmental factors, including pressure, temperature, and the challenges of communication through water. Signals transmitted between the surface and the depths can be delayed or limited, requiring careful coordination and planning. The risks involved extend beyond structural concerns. Equipment must function reliably in isolation, where repair is not possible once the descent has begun. Power systems must sustain all operations for the duration of the mission, and navigation must account for terrain that is only partially mapped. Any failure, whether mechanical or environmental, can compromise the mission, requiring immediate response or early return. Despite these challenges, expeditions have continued, each contributing to a growing understanding of the trench. Some missions have focused on mapping its contours, others on observing life or collecting samples from the seafloor. Each descent adds detail to what is known, while also revealing how much remains beyond reach. The process is gradual, shaped by the limitations of current technology and the complexity of the environment. Through these efforts, humans extend their presence into a space that cannot be inhabited directly, relying on engineered systems to bridge the distance. The trench remains largely beyond continuous access, yet each mission creates a connection, allowing brief moments of observation within a depth that continues to resist sustained exploration. Distance imposes a quiet barrier, that technology has not yet fully crossed. Even when vessels descend successfully and instruments begin to record their surroundings, the connection to the surface remains fragile, shaped by the properties of water itself. Signals do not travel easily through this medium, and those that do are limited in speed and clarity. Communication relies on acoustic transmission, where sound carries information upward, yet this method introduces delays and constraints. Data moves slowly, often reduced in detail, and continuous streams are difficult to maintain. The result is a link that functions, but not without interruption or limitation. Because of this, control over submersible systems is not always immediate. Commands sent from the surface require time to reach their destination, and responses return with similar delay. This affects how missions are conducted, requiring careful planning rather than constant adjustment. Operators must anticipate conditions rather than react instantly, guiding equipment through environments that cannot be fully seen in real time. Autonomy becomes necessary, with systems designed to operate independently when direct communication is insufficient. Power presents another boundary. Submersibles, whether manned or unmanned, depend on stored energy to sustain all functions during a descent. Batteries must support propulsion, lighting, sensors, and communication, all within a finite capacity. As depth increases, the demands on these systems remain constant, yet opportunities to recharge do not exist. Each mission is defined by the limits of its energy supply, determining how long the vessel can remain at depth and how far it can travel before returning. To conserve power, operations are carefully managed. Movement is kept minimal, lighting is used selectively, and instruments are activated only when necessary. These choices extend the duration of a mission, but they also restrict the amount of data that can be collected. Extended exploration of a single area may require multiple descents, each contributing a portion of the overall understanding. The process becomes incremental, shaped by the need to balance observation with endurance. Mapping the trench introduces further complexity. Sonar systems provide broad outlines, yet their resolution decreases with distance and variation in terrain. Detailed mapping requires closer proximity, where instruments can capture finer features, but reaching every section at such range is not easily achieved. The trench extends across a large area, and each segment presents its own challenges, from uneven surfaces to shifting sediments that can alter readings. Navigation within this space depends on a combination of sensors and pre-existing data, both of which may contain uncertainties. Without continuous visual reference, position must be inferred through measurements that can accumulate small errors over time. Returning to a precise location requires careful alignment of multiple systems, and even then, slight deviations can lead to different surroundings. This affects not only mapping, but also the ability to revisit specific features or observations. The pace of exploration reflects these combined limitations. Each descent is planned with attention to available power, communication constraints, and the need to collect meaningful data within a limited time frame. Progress does not occur through continuous presence, but through repeated visits, each adding detail to a gradually expanding picture. The trench is not mapped in a single effort, but through a series of partial views that must be assembled over time. In this way, technology extends reach without fully overcoming the conditions it encounters. The environment sets boundaries that cannot be bypassed, only worked within. Exploration continues, guided by these constraints, advancing steadily while acknowledging that much remains beyond the current limits of observation and connection. Not all ocean trenches share the same character, even when they reach similar depths. Each forms under its own set of conditions, shaped by the movements of the plates that define it and the surrounding ocean that influences how it evolves. When placed alongside others, the Puerto Rico Trench reveals distinctions that are not immediately visible in depth alone, but become clearer through the processes that created it and the way it continues to change. In the Pacific, trenches such as the Mariana Trench exist along boundaries where one plate moves decisively beneath another, forming a well-defined subduction zone. The structure there is more direct, with a clear and continuous descent of one plate beneath the other. This process produces a trench that is sharply outlined and consistently deep, with geological activity that follows a more predictable pattern over long periods. The Pacific itself, being larger and more active in terms of plate interactions, contains multiple trenches formed through similar mechanisms. The Puerto Rico Trench differs in its formation. While it also marks a boundary between plates, the interaction is less straightforward, influenced by the surrounding structure of the Atlantic. The motion of the North American plate beneath the Caribbean plate occurs with variations that introduce complexity into the shape of the trench. Instead of a single continuous form, it presents a series of segments and variations where depth and structure shift along its length. This creates a landscape that is less uniform, with features that reflect a more intricate set of forces. These differences extend to how the trench is explored. The Mariana Trench has been the focus of more frequent expeditions, in part because of its distinction as the deepest known point in the global ocean. Its prominence has drawn sustained attention, leading to repeated descents and more detailed mapping over time. The Puerto Rico Trench, while significant in its own right, has not received the same level of continuous exploration. Its position within the Atlantic, where fewer deep trenches exist, has contributed to a different pattern of study, with missions occurring less frequently and covering smaller portions of its extent. The surrounding ocean also plays a role in shaping these distinctions. The Atlantic, still widening through the gradual separation of tectonic plates, exhibits a different balance of forces compared to the Pacific. Mid-ocean ridges, where new crust forms, influence the distribution of stress across the basin, affecting how trenches develop and behave. This results in features that are often less pronounced or less extensive than those found in the Pacific, where subduction zones dominate the edges of the basin. Environmental conditions further contribute to the uniqueness of the Puerto Rico Trench. The distribution of currents, the composition of sediments, and the patterns of geological activity all differ from those found in other regions. These factors influence not only the physical structure of the trench, but also the processes that occur within it, from the movement of the seafloor to the distribution of life. When viewed in this broader context, the trench becomes part of a larger system where each region reflects the conditions that shape it. It is not defined solely by its depth, but by the combination of forces that have formed it and continue to influence it. The differences between this trench and others are not simply variations in scale, but expressions of how the Earth's surface evolves under different circumstances. In this way, comparison reveals not a hierarchy, but a range of forms, each one shaped by its own history and environment. The Puerto Rico Trench stands as one example within that range, its characteristics reflecting the unique conditions of the Atlantic and the quieter, more complex interactions that define it. At scales too small to follow with the eye, life persists with a steadiness that does not draw attention to itself. These organisms exist within the water, within the sediment, and within the structures that form along the seafloor, occupying spaces that extend beyond what larger forms can use. Their presence is continuous, forming a layer of activity that supports processes occurring throughout the environment, even when it is not directly observed. Many of these organisms are bacteria adapted to conditions that would disrupt most known biological systems. They exist under constant pressure, maintaining cellular functions that remain stable despite the surrounding force. Their internal structures are arranged in ways that prevent collapse or dysfunction, allowing essential processes to continue without interruption. Membranes retain their integrity, enzymes function within narrow tolerances, and chemical reactions proceed in balance with the environment. This stability is not accidental, but the result of gradual adaptation over long periods. Genetic structures within these organisms have developed to support resilience under extreme conditions, preserving functions that might otherwise degrade. Variations that allow for greater tolerance to pressure are maintained, while less stable forms do not persist. Over time, this process refines their capacity to exist within a setting that imposes continuous physical constraints. These microorganisms contribute to the surrounding ecosystem in ways that extend beyond their size. Through their metabolic processes, they transform chemical compounds into forms that can be used by other organisms. This activity forms a foundation upon which more complex interactions are built, supporting networks of life that depend on the continuous cycling of materials. Without these transformations, many of the processes that sustain larger forms would not occur. Within the sediment, they play a role in breaking down organic matter that settles from above, converting it into components that re-enter the system. Along mineral surfaces, they interact with chemical gradients, influencing the distribution of compounds within the environment. Their activity is constant, though not visible, shaping conditions that affect the broader structure of life within the trench. The presence of these organisms also reflects a level of adaptability that extends beyond immediate survival. Their genetic systems allow for responses to variations in their surroundings, adjusting to changes in temperature, pressure, or chemical composition. This flexibility supports their persistence across different regions within the trench, allowing them to occupy niches that may shift over time. For scientific study, these organisms provide insight into the limits of life under extreme conditions. By examining how their cellular structures and genetic systems function, researchers gain a deeper understanding of how biological processes can operate beyond the environments typically associated with life. The mechanisms that allow them to maintain stability under pressure offer information that can be applied to broader questions about biology and the range of conditions in which it can exist. Their existence also informs the search for life in other environments where similar conditions may be present. If organisms can function under the pressures and chemical conditions found here, it suggests that life may not be restricted to environments that resemble those at the surface. The adaptability observed at this scale expands the range of possibilities considered when examining other locations where biological processes might occur. Despite their small size, these microorganisms represent a significant portion of the living system within the trench. Their activity supports the continuity of processes that extend throughout the environment, linking chemical transformations to biological function. They do not stand apart from the larger system, but form an integral part of it, operating continuously within the same conditions that shape all life in these depths. Without the influence of light, evolution follows a path that diverges steadily from what is observed in illuminated environments. Traits that once depended on visibility lose their relevance, and over time, they diminish or disappear. Vision, which requires both light and energy to maintain, becomes less useful in a space where it offers little advantage. Eyes may reduce in size, lose complexity, or vanish entirely, replaced by structures that no longer serve their original function. This loss is not sudden but gradual, unfolding across generations as organisms adapt to conditions where sight no longer contributes to survival. Energy that would have been used to support visual systems is redirected toward other processes, allowing for the development of alternative sensory mechanisms. These changes do not occur in isolation, but as part of a broader adjustment where each trait aligns more closely with the environment in which it exists. In place of vision, other forms of perception become more refined. Sensitivity to chemical signals allows organisms to detect traces of substances in the water, guiding movement and interaction without the need for visual confirmation. Pressure detection enables awareness of nearby motion, translating subtle disturbances into information about direction and proximity. These senses operate continuously, forming a network of perception that extends beyond what sight alone could provide in such conditions. Over extended periods, populations within the trench remain separated from those in other regions. The depth itself acts as a barrier, limiting movement between environments and reducing the exchange of genetic material. This isolation allows evolutionary changes to accumulate independently, producing variations that are specific to the conditions of the trench. Even when similar forms exist elsewhere, their counterparts in these depths may differ in structure, function, or behavior, reflecting the unique pressures of their surroundings. The absence of light also influences how organisms interact with one another. Without visual cues, communication and recognition rely on other signals, shaping behaviors that align with these alternative forms of perception. Patterns of movement, chemical release, and other non-visual indicators become central to interaction, guiding processes such as feeding and reproduction. These behaviors evolve alongside physical traits, forming systems that operate effectively within the constraints of the environment. As these adaptations continue, the resulting forms may appear unfamiliar when compared to organisms shaped by light. Features that are common elsewhere may be absent, while others emerge that serve functions specific to this setting. The overall structure of these organisms reflects a balance between the limitations imposed by darkness and the opportunities created by alternative sensory pathways. This process leads to evolutionary paths that diverge from those found in more familiar environments. The absence of light does not halt development, but redirects it, allowing for variations that might not arise under different conditions. Over long spans of time, these differences become more pronounced, producing forms that are distinct yet fully adapted to their surroundings. The trench, in this way, becomes a space where evolution proceeds along lines defined by absence as much as by presence. Traits are shaped not only by what is available, but by what is not, creating a system where adaptation reflects both the constraints and the possibilities of the environment. Each organism carries within it the record of these changes, a result of processes that continue quietly, shaping life in ways that remain consistent with the conditions that define this depth. Nothing here is isolated, even at this depth. Movement continues, not in visible waves or rapid shifts, but as slow, persistent currents that pass through the trench and extend far beyond it. These flows originate from differences in temperature, salinity, and density across the ocean, creating pathways that carry water along routes that span entire basins. As they pass through the trench, they connect it to regions both near and distant, linking its processes to a larger system that remains in constant motion. These deep currents move steadily, often too gradually to be noticed in a single observation, yet over time they transport significant volumes of water. Along with that movement comes the transfer of materials, including nutrients and dissolved compounds, that circulate through the ocean. What settles into the trench does not remain there indefinitely, and what enters from elsewhere becomes part of its environment. This exchange forms a continuous cycle where substances are redistributed rather than confined. Nutrient cycles within this system operate across multiple layers, connecting surface processes to those occurring at depth. Organic material produced in illuminated waters eventually descends, carried downward through the water column. Some of this material reaches the trench, where it contributes to the resources available within the environment. At the same time, chemical transformations occurring in deeper regions influence the composition of the water that continues to move through the system. These processes do not remain localized, but become part of a broader circulation that extends across the ocean. The trench also participates in regulating aspects of the global system, though its influence is not immediately visible. By acting as a pathway for deep currents, it contributes to the movement of water masses that affect temperature distribution and chemical balance across large distances. The exchange of materials within these currents supports processes that operate at a planetary scale, linking regions that might otherwise appear disconnected. Over extended periods, this movement contributes to the stability of the ocean as a whole. Variations in one area can be moderated through the redistribution of water and materials, allowing the system to maintain balance despite localized changes. The trench, as part of this network, plays a role in these adjustments, even though its presence is not directly apparent at the surface. This connection also influences the life that exists within the trench. Organisms rely on the continuous input of materials carried by currents, as well as the chemical conditions shaped by this movement. The environment is not static, but part of a dynamic system where inputs and outputs are constantly in motion. The availability of resources, though limited, is maintained through this ongoing exchange, allowing life to persist within the constraints of the setting. The relationship between the trench and the rest of the ocean reflects a broader principle where no region exists in complete separation. Each part contributes to the function of the whole, participating in cycles that extend beyond immediate observation. The trench does not stand apart as an isolated feature, but operates within the same system that shapes conditions across the entire ocean. In this way, the depth becomes part of a larger continuity where processes connect distant regions through slow and steady movement. What occurs here influences, and is influenced by, conditions elsewhere, forming a network that maintains balance across scales. The connections remain largely unseen, yet they persist, guiding the flow of water and materials through the ocean in a manner that integrates even the deepest parts into the broader structure of the Earth. There are stretches of this place that have never been crossed, not because they are unreachable in theory, but because no path has yet been traced through them with certainty. Between the points where instruments have descended and the areas where observations have been made, there remain wide intervals that exist without direct record. These regions are not defined by absence, but by distance from what has been observed, extending outward in ways that are difficult to measure fully. The trench spans a length and depth that cannot be captured in a single effort. Each descent reveals a portion, a narrow passage of understanding that ends at the limits of time, power, and position. Beyond that boundary, the environment continues unchanged, holding its structure and its processes without interruption. The map that exists is partial, composed of segments that align imperfectly, leaving spaces where detail has not yet been filled. Within these spaces, the presence of life is assumed, not through speculation, but through patterns already observed. Where organisms have been found in one area, Similar conditions suggest their existence in others, though direct confirmation is absent. The distribution of species likely extends beyond recorded encounters, forming networks that have not yet been traced. Each observed form becomes part of a larger context that remains incomplete, hinting at continuity that has not been fully documented. Unknown species are not defined by rarity alone, but by the limits of observation. Forms that have not been recorded may exist in regions that have not been visited or in conditions that have not been sampled. The environment supports a range of adaptations, and within that range, variation continues to emerge. What has been seen provides a framework, but it does not represent the full extent of what is present. Scientific understanding reflects this incompleteness. Questions remain not because answers are absent, but because the data required to form them has not yet been gathered. Processes observed in one location may not apply uniformly across the entire trench, and without comprehensive coverage, patterns remain partially defined. The relationship between different regions, the full extent of biological diversity, and the detailed structure of the seafloor all exist within a space that has not been entirely explored. This uncertainty does not indicate a lack of knowledge, but rather the scale at which knowledge is still developing. Each observation adds to a growing body of information, yet also reveals the extent of what remains beyond it. The trench is not a closed system that can be fully described through a limited number of observations, but a complex environment that requires continued exploration to approach a more complete understanding. The unseen portions are not separate from what has been observed, but part of the same continuous structure. Conditions extend across these areas, shaping life and processes in ways that are consistent with what is known, while also allowing for variation that has not yet been encountered. The absence of direct observation does not imply absence of activity, but reflects the distance between current capability and the full extent of the environment. In this way, the trench holds a scale that exceeds immediate comprehension. It is not defined solely by what has been recorded, but by the combination of known and unknown elements that together form its entirety. The areas that remain unseen are not empty spaces, but regions that continue to exist without interruption, maintaining their structure and processes beyond the reach of current exploration. What lies within these depths continues without need for observation, shaped by the same forces that define the rest of the trench. The unknown remains present, not as a void, but as a continuation of what has already been glimpsed, extending outward in ways that remain to be revealed. Value does not always come from what is easily seen or frequently visited. In places like this, significance emerges through the quiet accumulation of insight, where each observation adds to a broader understanding that extends beyond the immediate environment. The trench holds importance not because of its distance or difficulty, but because of what it reveals about processes that operate across the Earth, often beyond direct perception. Scientific study within this setting contributes to a deeper awareness of how physical and biological systems function under conditions that differ from those at the surface. Observations gathered here inform models that describe pressure tolerance, chemical interaction, and energy use, expanding the range of environments considered when examining the limits of life. These insights do not remain confined to this location, but apply to questions that span multiple disciplines, from oceanography to biology and beyond. Geologically, the trench offers a record of movement that continues beneath the surface. The interaction between tectonic plates in this region provides information about how stress is distributed and released over time. By examining the structure and behavior of the seafloor, researchers gain a clearer view of processes that influence seismic activity and shape the Earth's outer layer. These patterns contribute to a broader understanding of how similar systems operate elsewhere, allowing connections to be drawn between different regions. The environment also serves as a setting in which life adapts to conditions that challenge conventional expectations. Organisms here demonstrate that biological systems can function without reliance on sunlight, using alternative pathways to sustain themselves. This expands the definition of habitability, suggesting that life can persist in environments that differ significantly from those typically associated with biological activity. Such understanding informs the study of ecosystems in other extreme settings, both on Earth and beyond. The trench's relevance extends into the future, particularly as exploration continues to develop. Advances in technology are shaped by the demands of environments like this, where equipment must operate reliably under pressure and in the absence of direct communication. Each mission contributes to improvements in design, navigation, and data collection, refining the tools used to explore not only the deep ocean, but other challenging environments as well. These developments also influence how information is gathered and interpreted. The need to work within constraints encourages approaches that prioritize efficiency and adaptability, leading to methods that can be applied in a range of contexts. As exploration progresses, the lessons learned here become part of a broader framework that supports continued discovery. Beyond practical applications, the trench holds a role in shaping how the natural world is understood. It demonstrates that complexity exists in places that are not immediately accessible, and that systems continue to operate regardless of observation. This perspective encourages a view of the Earth as interconnected, where each part contributes to the whole, even when it remains largely unseen. The importance of this place, then, lies not in a single discovery, but in the accumulation of many, each one adding detail to an evolving understanding. It serves as a point of reference for how systems function under conditions that differ from those at the surface, offering insight into processes that are otherwise difficult to observe directly. In this way, the trench remains relevant not only for what it contains, but for what it represents. It stands as part of a larger effort to understand the Earth in its entirety, contributing knowledge that extends beyond its boundaries, and supporting exploration that continues to expand the scope of what is known. There is a steadiness here that does not shift with urgency or interruption. Movement exists, yet it unfolds at a pace that feels removed from the rhythms of the surface. Nothing rushes, nothing surges forward with sudden force. Instead, the environment maintains a consistent state where change occurs gradually, shaped by processes that extend across long spans of time. The water itself holds this stillness, carrying only the faintest motion as currents pass through with quiet persistence. These flows do not disturb the surrounding space in obvious ways, but move through it with continuity, guiding particles and organisms along paths that are not immediately visible. The absence of turbulence allows the environment to remain stable, with each element maintaining its position or drifting slowly within the larger system. Life within this setting reflects that same measured pace. Organisms move with restraint, conserving energy in a place where resources are limited and encounters are infrequent. Motion is deliberate, each action carried out with efficiency rather than speed. There is no need for rapid movement, no advantage in sudden bursts of activity. Instead, survival depends on consistency, on the ability to persist within a system that rewards patience over urgency. Sound does not travel here in the way it does above. While vibrations move through the water, the overall impression is one of reduced noise, where distinct signals are rare and often subtle. The environment does not produce constant background activity, and without external disturbances, the space remains largely undisturbed. What sound exists is carried over distance, spreading gradually and fading without abrupt change. The absence of light reinforces this sense of continuity. Without cycles of day and night, there is no shifting pattern to mark the passage of time. The environment remains visually constant, unaffected by external illumination. This lack of variation influences how processes unfold, removing cues that might otherwise signal change. Life adapts to this constancy, operating within a framework that does not rely on alternating conditions. In this setting, rhythm is defined not by rapid transitions, but by sustained processes that continue without interruption. Biological functions proceed at rates that align with the availability of energy, often extending over long periods. Growth, movement, and interaction occur within this slower framework, forming patterns that differ from those observed in more dynamic environments. The seafloor itself reflects this calm continuity. Sediments settle gradually, forming layers that accumulate over time. Structures remain stable, shaped by forces that act slowly rather than suddenly. Even when changes occur, they do so within the same measured pace, maintaining the overall consistency of the environment. This steady nature creates a world that operates according to its own timing, independent of the fluctuations found elsewhere. It is not defined by absence alone, but by the presence of processes that unfold in a different manner. Each element contributes to a system that remains balanced through its consistency, where change is integrated rather than disruptive. Within this quiet structure, the environment continues without pause, guided by forces that do not require rapid motion or constant variation. The trench exists as part of a broader system, yet maintains a distinct rhythm, one that is shaped by depth, pressure, and the absence of external influences. It is a place where activity persists, not through intensity, but through continuity, forming a steady pattern that defines the nature of the deep. What has been gathered so far rests lightly against the vastness that remains. Each descent, each fragment of data, each recorded encounter forms a narrow thread within a much larger expanse that continues beyond reach. The accumulated knowledge does not close the space, but instead outlines its edges, revealing how much extends further than what has been traced. In this way, understanding grows alongside awareness of its own limits, expanding without ever fully enclosing the subject it seeks to describe. The trench remains one of the few places where this balance is still clearly visible. It exists within a world that has been mapped, measured, and observed across nearly every surface, yet here continuity gives way to gaps that have not been filled. The environment persists without constant presence, maintaining its structure and processes regardless of observation. This absence of complete coverage is not due to neglect, but to the scale and conditions that define it, placing it beyond the ease of continuous exploration. What has been seen offers clarity, yet also introduces new layers of complexity. Each observation aligns with known principles while extending them, suggesting variations that require further attention. Patterns appear, then shift as additional data is considered, forming a picture that remains in motion. The trench does not present itself as a static subject, but as a system that continues to unfold with each attempt to understand it. Within this setting, the idea of mystery persists, not as something distant or abstract, but as a natural part of the environment itself. It exists in the spaces between observations, in the regions that have not yet been crossed, and in the processes that continue without interruption. This presence does not diminish with knowledge, but evolves alongside it, maintaining a balance between what is known and what remains beyond immediate reach. The modern world often presents itself as fully observed, with systems that can be described and predicted with precision. Yet, places like this remind us that there are still regions where certainty gives way to approximation, where models remain incomplete, and where direct observation has not yet extended. The trench stands within this context, not as an exception, but as part of a broader reality in which exploration continues. As attention returns from these depths, what remains is not a conclusion, but a continuation. The environment below persists without change in its fundamental nature, shaped by the same forces that have defined it over time. Its processes continue steadily, unaffected by the intervals between observation, maintaining a presence that does not depend on being seen. The unseen portions are not separate from what has been observed, but part of the same continuous system, extending beyond current reach while remaining connected to it. Each new descent will add detail, refining the understanding that has begun to take shape, yet never fully replacing the sense of scale that defines the trench. In this quiet persistence, the depth holds its place as part of the Earth's broader structure, contributing to systems that operate across distances and timescales that extend far beyond immediate perception. It remains present, not as an absence, but as a continuation of processes that move without interruption. And far below, beyond the reach of light and the limits of current observation, the trench continues as it always has, its depths unfolding slowly within the vast, unseen layers of the ocean.